After I refused to sell him my backlot, my neighbor faked a survey and built a gazebo on it. Told me land belongs to the bold while I spent thousands fighting it. Then he accidentally sent me a voice recording bragging, and I took it straight to court. When I first saw the wooden posts sticking out of my backlot, I thought the city had sent a crew by mistake. But when I walked closer, I realized it wasn't city workers. It was my neighbor, Gary, standing there with a tool belt and a stupid grin, hammering away like he owned the place. He waved at me and said, "Mornin', neighbor. Just setting up a little gazebo for my family. Shouldn't take long." I just stood there, confused. "Gary, that's my land. That's part of my lot." He laughed. "Not anymore. Had it surveyed last month. Turns out your fence line's off by about 20 feet. Crazy, huh?" My stomach dropped. I'd lived in this house in Salem, Oregon, for 12 years. The property line had been the same since the day I moved in. That little half-acre of woods behind my fence wasn't much, but it was mine. I cleared it myself, kept it clean, even planted some maples back there. "Who did the survey?" I asked. He shrugged. "Oh, just a local company. You'll see the markers." The markers looked brand new. Little orange flags and white stakes driven neatly into the ground. The company name on them was North Pine Land Services, which I'd never heard of. By the end of the week, Gary had brought in lumber, concrete, and his buddies. They poured footings, set beams, and started building like they had every right. I called the county office, and that's when the nightmare started. The survey was filed, and it was legally registered. Except when I dug deeper, North Pine Land Services didn't exist. No business license, no listing, nothing. So I confronted him again. He didn't even pause his hammering. He just smirked and said, "Land belongs to the bold, my friend." I tried to reason with him. Then I called the cops. They said it was a civil issue, so I hired a lawyer. And that's when the money started bleeding out of me. Filing fees, title searches, surveyor consultations. Gary filed a squatter's claim, saying the land had been neglected and unused for years. I had to prove ownership all over again. Months went by. My yard became a war zone of stakes, fences, and tension. I barely slept. Then one night, something weird happened. I got a voicemail from Gary, except it wasn't for me. It sounded like a butt dial. I pressed play and my skin crawled. He was talking to someone, laughing. "Yeah, man, I told you it worked. I got him paying lawyers out the ass while I drink beer in my new gazebo. Idiot doesn't even know North Pines, just me and a printer." That was the moment I stopped being scared and started planning. Because Gary had just handed me everything I needed, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. When I bought my house in Salem, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was a fixer-upper, 3 bedrooms, a little creek running behind it, and a weirdly shaped lot that backed up to a line of tall evergreens. That back section was kind of a no-man's land when I moved in. Overgrown, rocky, full of blackberry vines. But over time, I cleared it out, hauled away junk, built a fire pit and a little shed. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful mine. Gary moved in next door 5 years later. He was one of those guys who talks too loud and too long, always has a beer in hand, and insists on giving advice you never asked for. First it was about gutters, then fences, then property taxes. Always with that smug, know-it-all tone like he thought I was a clueless idiot. At first, I tolerated him. He was annoying but harmless. But when his teenage son crashed a dirt bike through my fence, Gary shrugged it off like I should be thanking him for testing my fence's durability. I had to replace it myself. Then came the friendly favors. Gary would show up uninvited to borrow tools, pressure wash his driveway using my hose, and even let his dog crap in my yard because it's the same grass. Every time I said something, he'd grin and call me neighborly uptight. The final straw before all this started was about 2 years ago. Gary knocked on my door one Saturday and said, "Hey, I noticed you've got that extra space behind your fence. I've been thinking about putting in a gazebo for family barbecues. If you're not using it, I'll buy it off you." I told him no, flat out. That land was staying mine. He pushed again. "Come on, I'll give you a fair deal. You're not even doing anything with it." That pissed me off more than I expected. I told him the land wasn't for sale, and I wasn't interested in any deal. He got quiet, gave me this look that made my stomach tighten, and said, "You'll change your mind. Everyone does when they realize how much upkeep costs." I brushed it off back then. But a few months later, I noticed orange tape tied to a tree behind my fence. Then another one. I thought maybe the city was marking utilities or something. I didn't think much of it, until the day I found him actually building on it. Looking back, all the little things made sense. The questions he asked about my mortgage. The time he pretended to help by checking my property line. Even the way he'd mentioned knowing people at City Hall. He'd been planning this. And when I found out that North Pine Land Services didn't exist, I realized this wasn't just about a gazebo. It was about control. Gary wasn't after land, he was after me. I was losing money fast. My lawyer kept saying, "We need hard evidence of fraud, not just suspicion." That's why, when Gary's accidental voicemail came through, that smug laugh, that confession about making me pay out the ass, it felt like divine justice. He thought he was clever. He thought he'd broken me. But he'd just made his first real mistake. And I was about to make sure it cost him everything. Once I had that voicemail, things stopped being a slow burn and turned into a wildfire. I thought proof would make this easy. Play the recording for my lawyer, file for emergency injunction, make him take the gazebo down, and end this. Real life didn't cooperate. My lawyer listened, leaned back, and said the sentence that would haunt me for months. "It's good, but it's hearsay unless we can prove he sent it or it was intended for you." Translation. I had an admission, but not the chain of custody a court eats for breakfast. He told me to preserve everything and escalate carefully. So I did. I saved the voicemail in multiple formats, timestamped it, had a tech write a short affidavit saying the file hadn't been altered. It helped, but it wasn't the knockout punch I dreamed of. Meanwhile, Gary doubled down. He started showing up on my side of the fence with measuring tapes as if he hadn't already faked a survey. He brought over men I'd never seen before, kind of local toughs who drank out of paper cups and stared at me with a pleasant sort of menace. They referred to the gazebo as ours. Once, one of them pushed into my yard while I was repairing a fence panel and told me to keep my hands off the property line. When I asked him to leave, he laughed and said, "This is neighbor business. You don't need a lawyer here." He kept filing papers. A squatter's claim here, a prescriptive easement claim there. Each filing had little half-truths and tiny dates that suddenly made the county clerk's eyes glaze over. The county scheduled a hearing. The hearing meant lawyers, and lawyers meant hourly rates that made my stomach tie in knots. I was watching my savings evaporate into briefs and depositions. Gary's strategy was textbook. Bury you in paperwork. Make the calendar your enemy. While I was paying to answer affidavits, he hosted barbecue parties in a structure nailed into my ground. Kids from his family ran through my saplings. He posted photos of our new weekend spot on social media. His friends liked and commented with thumbs-up emojis. It felt obscene, like watching someone take a bite from the middle of your birthday cake and cheer about the frosting. At depositions, Gary sat across from me grinning like he'd won something. He told the court an alternate history where he'd used the land for years, had maintained parts of it, and, for dramatic effect, produced a survey with a different company name. Our surveyors fought like boxers in a ring. My surveyor swore he'd never worked for North Pine, and the county records showed no such company license. Gary shrugged and presented receipts printed on what looked like a home printer. The judge looked unimpressed. The law moves slow and loves paperwork. He ordered more discovery. Every phone call from my lawyer brought new demands. More documents, a forensic analysis of the voicemail, time-stamped satellite images, witness statements from the people who came to my home over the years. Friends and neighbors were sympathetic but skittish. No one wanted to be dragged into a neighbor feud with a man who'd shown a willingness to escalate. The cost of escalation wasn't just money. I stopped inviting friends over because the gazebo overshadowed everything. I had nightmares of the men laughing while sipping beer under a roof my taxes paid for. My relationship with my partner strained. We argued about whether to sell and run, to cut losses. For a while, I considered it. I imagined moving to a place where property lines weren't a battleground. Then small victories started to trickle in. A vendor I tracked down admitted on the phone that his survey had been ordered by Gary under a fake name. A neighbor confessed she'd seen Gary measuring when she watered her garden. One of the men who'd pushed into my yard sent me a text later that night that read, "Sorry, didn't know it was yours. Gary said it was fine." Those little cracks felt like oxygen. I saved every message, every sympathetic text, and I began to weave them into a narrative that showed intent and pattern. But I also knew Gary wasn't stupid. He'd set traps and planned for paperwork. If he'd manufactured a company, forged documents, and coached witnesses, he'd planned next moves too. So I started planning mine. It was late August when I found out just how far Gary had gone, and how deep the betrayal really was. My lawyer called one afternoon sounding strange, like he didn't want to tell me something. He said, "Listen, I don't want you to panic, but we just got notice that the county clerk updated the plat map. The boundary line's been adjusted. Temporarily." "Adjusted how?" I asked. "By about 20 feet, he said quietly. "Into your lot." I almost dropped the phone. That fake survey, the one we'd been fighting, was suddenly officially recognized by the county system. Even though the case wasn't resolved. Even though we'd proven the company was fake. Somehow, Gary's fake data had made it through. I drove straight to the county office. The clerk, a nervous guy named Brandon, showed me the system. Sure enough, the map showed Gary's property line creeping into mine, like a parasite. Brandon whispered that someone had filed a correction notice signed by an outside consultant, and the signature looked eerily familiar. When I saw the scan, my stomach flipped. It was my lawyer's signature, or at least a perfect copy of it. Someone had forged my lawyer's name on the boundary adjustment notice. I brought it to him immediately. He looked at it, turned pale, and swore he'd never seen it before. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. "This didn't come from the county. This was uploaded through the private submission portal. Only registered surveyors and legal representatives can access that." Gary had somehow gotten into that system. 2 days later, we found out how, through my lawyer's former assistant. Turns out, she'd worked for Gary's wife's cousin at a title company. When she left the firm, she still had the login credentials from the online filing portal. Gary had paid her to submit a few corrections under my lawyer's name. She confessed after we threatened to press charges. Said Gary told her it was just fixing an error, and that no one would notice. When I heard that, I almost couldn't speak. It wasn't just property lines anymore. This was fraud, computer access crimes, forgery, a deliberate setup to make me look like I was losing ground legally. Gary wasn't just bold. He was calculating. He wanted me broke and humiliated. He wanted to be able to tell everyone in the neighborhood that I'd been wrong all along, that I'd wasted money fighting something I'd already lost. My lawyer filed an emergency motion that same day. We submitted the forged documents as evidence, plus the voicemail, plus statements from the assistant. The judge froze all boundary changes and ordered a fraud investigation. I thought that would finally shut Gary down. But that night, when I came home from work, I saw his lights blazing. The gazebo was lit up like a damn casino. He and his buddies were having a party under it. Loud music, shouting, beer cans flying into my yard. When I yelled at them to quiet down, Gary walked right up to the fence, beer in hand, and said, "You really think anyone's gonna believe you? You're just some bitter homeowner with a grudge. I'm already winning, man." Then he grinned and added, "Your lawyer's not who you think he is either," and walked away laughing. That line, "Your lawyer's not who you think he is," burned in my head all night. The next morning, I decided to find out exactly what he meant. I barely slept that night. Gary's words, "Your lawyer's not who you think he is," kept echoing in my head. I didn't know what he meant, but it sounded deliberate, like he was daring me to look deeper. The next morning, I started digging. I called my lawyer's office to schedule a meeting. The receptionist hesitated and said, "He's out today, probably until Monday." But something about her tone felt off, tight, nervous. So I drove there anyway. His car was in the lot. Through the glass door, I could see him in his office, leaning over his desk, talking to someone. When I got closer, my stomach turned. It was Gary, sitting there like they were old friends. I didn't barge in. I stood outside, recording through the cracked door with my phone. Their voices came through, muffled but clear enough. My lawyer was saying, "You shouldn't have come here, Gary. If he finds out, I lose my license." Gary chuckled. "Relax. I'm just checking in. You're still getting your cut, right? He's bleeding out with these legal bills. Keep it that way." I felt my hands shaking. I stepped back before I did something stupid. My lawyer, the man I'd paid almost 15 grand by then, was in on it. Everything made sense. The delays, the weak filings, the excuses. He'd been dragging the case out so I'd keep paying while Gary consolidated his fake claim. I went home in a haze. I couldn't trust anyone. But I wasn't going to let either of them know I knew. Not yet. I called the state bar's disciplinary office and left a tip anonymously. Then I called my friend Connor, who worked in IT at the county courthouse. I told him everything. Connor didn't even hesitate. If he's submitting fake filings, I can pull the metadata. Every file uploaded to the county portal logs an IP address. That night, he sent me screenshots. The IP tied to the fake correction notice. The one with my lawyer's forged signature wasn't from my lawyer's office. It was from Gary's house. Now I had both men pinned. Gary for fraud and my lawyer for collusion. But I wanted more than justice. I wanted to humiliate Gary. I wanted him to feel the kind of helplessness he'd been feeding me for months. So I started baiting him. I left my blinds open so he could see me working late. I called his name loud enough for his cameras to catch. I wanted him to think I was unraveling, tired, broken, on the edge. Meanwhile, I was collecting evidence like a machine. Screen recordings, voicemail transcriptions, timestamps, bank records showing my lawyer's transfers. The night before the next hearing, I mailed everything to the district attorney's office, anonymously. A full packet with labeled evidence, screenshots, and even that recording of my lawyer talking to Gary. Then I set up one last trap. I invited Gary over, told him I wanted to settle this privately and get the stress over with. I offered to meet him at the gazebo, his precious little monument to arrogance. He showed up, smug as ever, beer in hand. I had my phone recording the entire time. "Let's just be honest," I said. "You forged that survey, didn't you?" He laughed. "Of course I did. And there's nothing you can do about it. Land belongs to the bold, right?" "Perfect." I smiled. "You're right. And recordings belong to the smart." I watched his grin fade as I lifted my phone. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 48 hours, both he and my lawyer were going to wish they'd never heard my name. When I walked into the gazebo that night, I thought I was walking into victory. I thought I had the evidence, the confession, the IP logs, the whole goddamn pile. Gary was there with two of his usual guys, sprawled out like kings. I set my phone on the table, hit record, and let him do his thing. He loved to perform. He bragged about the fake survey. He bragged about the forged uploads. He bragged about how he'd made my lawyer and how the county maps would stay crooked until I bled out. He swigged, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and told me about the future plans like they were already built. Then he leaned close and said something that should have been small, but it slammed me sideways. "We're just clearing the last holdouts. Harrison'll break ground next spring. Houses come down, townhomes go up. You should have sold when you had the chance." That name, Harrison, had a weight to it. I'd seen a Harrison and Company sign on a development 2 towns over. A slick banner promising modern living. I'd never imagined them poking around my street. But Gary didn't stop there. He laughed and mimicked a phone call he'd had, reading off addresses like credits at the end of a movie. 210 Maple, 214 Maple, 218 Maple, easy picks. Just gotta smooth out the board, get the map fixed, and the rest is paperwork. I froze. His voice was raw with hunger. This wasn't about a stupid gazebo. This was a land grab. I left that night with my hands shaking and the recording I'd secretly made. I thought it was enough. I took it straight to the DA's investigator I'd been feeding stuff to. He listened, played it back, and his face went hard. He said the words I'd been waiting for. This is conspiracy. This is organized. He didn't know the half of it. 2 days later, Connor, my IT friend at the courthouse, called me in a whisper. You need to get over here. Now. When I showed up, he had a printout with an IP trace and, tucked under it, something else that made my gut drop. A screenshot from a private Facebook group called Neighborhood Renewal. It was full of pictures. Smiling men at barbecues, a whiteboard covered in street names, and, in one photo, Gary grinning next to a man I recognized from a county planning meeting. His caption read, Phase 2 list, Harrison ready to roll. Connor scrolled. This isn't just Gary. Look at these members. He pointed to names. A county planner, a title company rep, a local real estate broker. Then he swallowed and said, Those IP logs you turned over? Some of them trace back to the developer's office. I thought I understood the enemy. I didn't. What I was staring at now was a network, people with access to county portals, a developer with capital, and local fixers like Gary who could run the dirt-level jobs. My fight with my neighbor had been a test run, a practice seizure to see what resistance looked like. But the twist that punched me in the throat was the one I found in Gary's texts saved on my phone, the ones he'd sent me by accident weeks before. When I replayed them, there was background noise I'd never noticed. A woman's voice, calm and clinical, saying, Make sure Weiler signs off. Don't forget the tax abatement angle. If the old man challenges, we reassess and then buy him out. Weiler was the county assessor's last name. Tax abatement. Reassess. Buy him out. Clicked like a trap closing. This wasn't just land grabbing for a gazebo. This was a coordinated displacement. Manufacture surveys, change maps, apply legal pressure, force owners into expensive fights, then swoop in with developer money to buy at a discount, wash, rinse, profit. I drove home with my hands white on the wheel. The scale of it made my anger rawer and colder. They'd built a system that turned neighbors into weapons and paperwork into a battering ram. And now I had proof they were aiming higher than me. But I also had something they didn't expect. I'd been recording everything from the start. Conversations, texts, party photos, the Facebook group that celebrated the wins. I had pieces that could snap together into a blueprint. The problem was this: the bigger I went, the more dangerous it felt. A network like that doesn't like loose ends. I sat in my living room that night and thought about what it would cost me to bring them down. Money, yes. Time, definitely. But also the risk that if I pulled the wrong thread, they'd pull a much bigger one back. I was done being bait. I was done pretending I was fraying at the edges. I was going to pull the thread. But I didn't yet know what would happen when I yanked hard enough. What I found next chilled me more than anything. Not because it was illegal, but because it was deliberate. After that night with Connor, I couldn't stop digging. I spent hours on public records sites, scanning filings, deeds, zoning applications. Every time I typed Gary's name, I saw patterns. Quick ownership transfers, sudden corrections. Shell LLCs that existed for months and vanished. He wasn't acting alone, he was part of a chain, and every link looked the same. Then, through a records request, I got access to one document that explained everything. A redevelopment proposal filed by Harrison and Company. It was dated almost 2 years before the gazebo incident. Right there on the map, in neat gray lines, was my street, my house, marked as Phase 1 acquisition. And beside it, handwritten in the margin, negotiate or neutralize. That word, neutralize, made my stomach turn. Harrison and Company had a plan to buy out the entire strip of houses along our creek. The city had quietly approved a revitalization zone that gave them the power to seize or rezone properties under the pretext of public improvement. But before they could move in, they needed to show that the land was under dispute or abandoned. That's where Gary came in. He wasn't just a greedy neighbor. He was a plant. The company had approached him a year earlier with an offer. If he could soften resistance from local owners, meaning me and 2 other holdouts, he'd get a payout and first dibs on one of the new townhomes they'd build. His job was to make the property line a mess, tie me up in court, and drive me toward either bankruptcy or a forced sell. And my lawyer? He'd been on Harrison's payroll too, not for cash directly, but for consulting fees funneled through the same fake company name, North Pine Land Services. It wasn't even subtle once I saw it. My lawyer's firm had received 3 deposits from North Pine during the same months he was representing me. When I confronted him later, after the DA froze his accounts, he admitted it all like he was explaining a business deal. He said, "You were never supposed to lose your house, just the back lot. We needed it clear for the road extension. You could have kept your home if you just cooperated." He said it so calmly it made my skin crawl. He'd been paid to make me lose slowly, to keep me thinking I had a chance. So I'd pour every dollar into fighting back until I couldn't afford to anymore. That's what Gary meant when he said, "Land belongs to the bold." It wasn't about courage. It was about corruption dressed up as confidence. I asked him why they picked me. Why not one of the other neighbors? He didn't even blink. Because you lived alone. No family, no connections in the city. You were the easiest to pressure. Gary said you'd cave. Something in me cracked when I heard that. Every sleepless night, every dollar wasted, every time I stood by my fence wondering how my life got hijacked. It was all by design. They'd studied me like I was a problem to be solved. And for what? A private access road to a new row of luxury townhomes. Gary's gazebo was never about barbecues or property lines. It was a proof of concept. A way to test if they could physically occupy disputed land without triggering police intervention. And it worked. For months. That realization made something cold settle inside me. The kind of cold that doesn't shake. Because now I didn't just want justice. I wanted exposure. I wanted names. I wanted them to taste what it feels like to lose everything under the guise of business. And I had a plan forming. One that would use their own arrogance, their own paperwork, and their own boldness against them. Once I knew the whole picture, I stopped reacting and started building my counterattack like a construction project. I had everything: recordings, signatures, emails, money trails. But raw evidence isn't enough. People like Gary and the Harrison Group survive because no one looks at the whole story at once. They count on isolation, confusion, exhaustion. I needed to make it visible. First, I looped in the DA's investigator again. Instead of dribbling out proof, I brought a full binder and a drive with every file neatly indexed. Survey forgeries, the neutralized map, bank transfers from North Pine into my lawyer's accounts, even video of Gary confessing at the gazebo. I made sure to hand over clean, verifiable copies, not the originals. Those stayed locked in a safety deposit box under a friend's name. Then I called a reporter. Not one of those glossy local interest types. A small-town investigative journalist named Rachel who'd written about zoning corruption before. I gave her everything, including permission to use my name. She verified it fast. Within a week, she had county sources confirming the fake filings, the logins, and the link between North Pine and Harrison and Company. The morning her article dropped, my phone exploded. Headline: Land belongs to the bold? Salem developers' dirty playbook exposed. It laid out everything: the forged surveys, the complicit lawyer, the pilot seizure disguised as a gazebo build. It quoted Gary's own words from my recording. They even printed the line where he called me the idiot next door. The piece went viral locally by noon. By that evening, the DA's office had raided Gary's house and his office. They found 2 laptops, fake invoices, and drafts of more boundary correction forms for other properties on my block. The assistant who'd uploaded the fake document cut a deal immediately, handing over emails that showed Gary forwarding instructions from a Harrison project manager. Harrison and Company tried to deny everything, but the paper trail was too clean. Within a month, the state licensing board suspended their permits pending investigation. My lawyer was disbarred before Christmas. The county voided every fraudulent survey, reinstated the old maps, and issued a public apology for administrative oversight. The judge ordered Gary to demolish the gazebo and restore the land at his own expense. I made sure to be home the day the crew showed up. Watching them rip down his monument beam by beam felt like air filling my lungs again. It took months, but I got reimbursed through restitution, legal fees, property restoration, even damages for emotional distress. I didn't care about the money as much as the moment the county officer handed me the final deed confirmation and said, "It's officially yours again." Gary moved out quietly a few weeks later. Rumor was he'd taken a plea deal. Last I heard, he was living in a trailer 2 towns over, banned from holding any property development license for 10 years. Sometimes I walk back to that cleared patch of land where the gazebo used to stand. It's quiet now, just the creek, the wind, and my maples finally taking root again. There's still a faint outline in the dirt where the posts once stood. I left it there on purpose, because every time I see it, I remember what he said the first day I confronted him. Land belongs to the bold. He was right in a way. He just never expected the bold one to be me.